Good evening. It's such a pleasure to have you all here tonight. My name is Anka Badurina, and I am the Executive Director of Building One Community. It's a real pleasure. Thank you. It's really a pleasure to welcome you to our 7th annual Colloquium. We have a terrific panel tonight, and I'm very positive you're going to enjoy this evening discussion about the different roles, the different factors driving forced migration, and the role our community can play in supporting immigrant integration. The American dream is perhaps best captured in how people talk about the future, especially for their kids. And I don't think anyone here in this room will be surprised to hear me say that for the newer working class immigrants, the American dream is alive and well in Stamford. We at B1C have seen over and over, and recent studies actually confirm that immigrants in the US today are integrating into our society and contributing to our economy just as immigrants did 100 years ago. The languages of immigrants might be different today and more diverse, but their journey is the same. It's not an easy path, and it has never been easy. For more than a decade, B1C has been able to make a huge difference in the life of immigrants. We serve their most critical needs, from teaching English and vocational skills to providing immigration legal services to helping ensure that immigrant children succeed in school. Our participants show persistence and hard work. Through our program and services, they achieve incredible milestones and become a vital part of building a stronger Stamford, Fairfield County, and country. Let me give you just one example. Participants in our Immigrant Entrepreneurship Incubator program opened 13 businesses last year. That's 13 new local businesses. So since last time we met here, B1C has been extremely busy. So here are a couple of key updates. As you may know, we just opened a new location in 417 Shipan Avenue on the east side of Stamford. We kicked off programming just right the next day. So we moved on a Friday, Saturday, we held our first citizenship class, and 2 days later, we kick off our summer enrichment program. So how is that for a quick start? So in this short amount of time, it has been clear to us that having 2 locations allow us to serve a much broader community. The second floor of Select remains a vibrant, active space, while the new Shipan space welcomes both our long-standing participants and the many new faces that come to our doors daily. The number of adults registered July and August this year is already up 15% compared to last year. And that's just in 2 months. So we're very optimistic. Our English language classes are also continuing to thrive, and I am happy to share that last week we surpassed our pre-pandemic attendance numbers. So we're coming out of the pandemic. A few of these learners are actually new arrivals. Some are people that Governor Abbott bused from Texas to New York City and who quickly made their way to Fairfield County. Our immigration legal services programs continue to grow. We filed 89 immigration applications in the first half of the year, our most ever, and our removal defense practice has now 85 active cases. I could talk a lot more about our programs, but I guess we have a panel to go to, so I'll just say, come and visit us. We will show you firsthand. We're gonna have a grand opening at some point in October, so stay tuned, we'll be sending invitations. But before I introduce the panel, a few thank yous are in order. Looking around this room, I cannot but feel deeply, deeply grateful that you're all here, including Mayor Simmons. Thank you so much for coming tonight. So let's start. Thank you to our sponsors. You make this evening and our work possible. And thank you to those of you who have donated the amazing items that we had for our silent auction this evening. I saw some real bidding action out there. So we will be announcing the winners before the session wraps up around 8:30. I'd also like to thank our events committee who have masterfully and gracefully, as always, put together this fantastic event. A special shout out to our Colloquium co-chairs, Sarita Hanley, Marianne Kahn, and Ann Downey. Our board, of course, it makes me very happy to see many of you here tonight. Thank you so much for guiding us with your leadership and wisdom. Our staff, who every day give their very best to bring A-level programs to the immigrant community we have the privilege to serve. And last but not least, thank you to all of you for taking time to join us tonight and to be part of this critically important discussion. So now let me present tonight's impressive panel. Muzaffar Chishti, I hope I'm saying the last name right. I tried to rehearse a couple of times. He's an attorney, he's a Migration Policy Institute, also known as MPI, Senior Fellow and Director of the MPI Office at New York University School of Law. His work focuses on US immigration policy at the federal, state, and local levels, the intersection of labor and immigration law, immigration enforcement, civil liberties, and immigrant integration. Welcome, Muz. Michael Hernandez, an immigrant himself, longtime friend and volunteer of B1C, is a Master's of Public Policy candidate at the University of Chicago and a graduate of the University of Connecticut with a dual degree in political science and economics in the honors program. Welcome, Mike. And Dr. Kathryn Libal is the director of the Human Rights Institute and an associate professor of social work and human rights at the University of Connecticut. Since 2007, she has taught at the School of Social Work and Human Rights Institute, specializing in human rights, refugee resettlement, and social welfare. Welcome, Kathy. And finally, our moderator this evening will be B1C's Jenn Williams, our removal defense director. Since 2007 as well, Jenn has practiced as an attorney specializing in immigration law with a focus on removal defense representation. Thank you. So, thank you all to our panelists for sharing your expertise tonight. And again, thank you everyone here tonight for helping make the dreams of our immigrant communities become a reality. Once again, welcome to our colloquium, and let the panel begin. Jenn, the floor is yours.
Can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay, good. Thank you, Anka, for kicking off tonight's 7th annual colloquium. As Anka said, my name is Jenn Williams, and I am the director of the Removal Defense Program at Building One Community. And it's an absolute honor to be here with all of you and moderate this esteemed panel. And thank you, audience members, for joining us on this absolutely spectacular evening. Last year it was very rainy, so I'm glad we had a chance to go outside and enjoy this good weather. Tonight is surely going to be a very lively and engaging discussion on the topic, the road to Connecticut, forced migration, integration, and the power of the community. No doubt we could spend countless hours dissecting each of those subtopics, but alas, we only have about an hour and a half together, so let's begin. From the beginning of time, groups of people or communities move about or migrate for a variety of reasons. Tonight, you'll hear from our panel about push and pull factors that bear on migration. Simply put, push factors are stressors that make living in one place difficult, if not impossible, to live there. Pull factors are often opportunities that pull people to a new location, whether it be for economic opportunities, reunification with family, or the promise of a better life. However, whether they be push or pull factors, every community, every individual, every participant at B1C has an important story to tell. It is important that we listen attentively and with kindness to one's push or pull factors, or often both. In the words of Dr. Bennett Amalu, a Nigerian-born physician, we are members of one another. What binds us together is far greater than what separates us because of our interconnectivity. What happens to the least of us happens to all of us. Whatever you do for the least of us, you can do for all of us. Since the launch of the removal defense practice exactly 1 year ago, our small but very mighty team has conducted over 100 consultations for individuals and families in removal proceedings at the Hartford Immigration Court. It's clear from our meetings with our clients that for many, the trauma behind the push factors can leave indelible marks, from escaping poverty and hunger, persecution by government regimes, persecution on account of sexual identity and expression, domestic and gender violence, armed conflict, and war. These individuals are refugees or asylum seekers who are forced to flee his or her home and are unable to return unless and until conditions are safe again, if ever. And in case anyone is wondering what is the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker, because the terms are often confused with one another, I'll explain. A refugee is one legally recognized by a state or receives the aid of an organization, such as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, for international protection due to serious human rights violations and persecution. On the other hand, an asylum seeker is one seeking protection from persecution who hasn't yet been legally recognized as a refugee and is waiting for a decision on their asylum application. So then some of you must be wondering, well, then what's an immigrant, right? There's all these words that all seem to mush together. Well, an immigrant is someone who makes a conscious decision to leave his or her home and move to a foreign country with the intention of settling there. Immigrants often go through a very lengthy vetting process to become lawful permanent residents of the United States. Adriana Podesta, in the back, tremendously leads our affirmative practice in providing those legal services to those intending immigrants who live abroad through consular processing or others residing here in the United States who have a pathway to permanent residency through another status. And I also want to make sure that we don't forget about climate migrants. They too are often overlooked these days. These are displaced persons due to climate change, deforestation, flooding, dwindling resources, drought, who must resettle because their place of origin is just uninhabitable. Many of the participants we serve at B1C are from Central America, a region that has had its fair share of climate change and those effects. For example, a considerable number of Guatemalans are emigrating due to climate change and the devastating effect it is having on the country's coffee crops. Tonight we'll also hear pull factors from migrants who have left their home to join their family or desire better education and studies, the availability for career opportunities, the need for health care, and the promise of a better quality of life for their family and children. They too are entitled to have their human rights protected and respected. Just this morning, I don't know if others had seen it on Bloomberg News, they reported that Labor Secretary Marty Walsh said the U.S. will eventually need to overhaul the nation's immigration system, calling the lack of available workers to fill jobs a bigger threat to the economy than the inflation. Labor Secretary Walsh pointed to immigration reform as a long-term solution to the issue. Lawmakers need to develop additional legal pathways for immigrants to apply for visas and focus on how to use immigration in a positive manner. So, with that introductory background, I would like to now turn our attention to our panelists. So this evening's discussion will go as follows. There'll be three rounds of questions for each panelist, and then we'll open up the questions for the audience members. And please, prepare your questions, put them on the index cards. When you're ready, raise your hand. And then we'll have Paola, Lauren, our amazing attorneys and IJC fellows come around and pick up the cards. Okay, all right, so let's get started. The first question is for Kathy. When the war in Ukraine broke out, the world watched in horror one of the greatest refugee and humanitarian crises unfold. The UN reported in July 2022 that at least 12 million people had fled their homes since Russia's invasion. Now, we're certainly aware of current push factors like violence on that scale, but there are a number of drivers of forced migration unfolding constantly around the world. Could you please kick us off by telling a bit more about the important push factors causing people to migrate to the US, and in particular this part of the Northeast? And lastly, what is the current state of the displaced population?
So, and I also have 3 to 5 minutes to cover all those dimensions.
Sorry, it wasn't one question, it was 3 questions.
So, first of all, I really would like to thank Anka Badurina and Elena Perez Moreno for their extraordinary hospitality and the organizational work that went into this event. I know what's behind such events, and it just is, it's phenomenal. I've already written to my colleagues how impressed I was with the community turnout. Mm-hmm. And I'm originally from Alaska and have resettled in Connecticut for the last 20 years. And I became involved in looking at issues of refugee resettlement and eventually the support for asylum seekers because of the Iraq War and my own work in the Middle East and Turkey, which received many Iraqis during the period in which the US was in Iraq. So my background actually is more on the side of looking at the community work with refugees and asylum seekers, although I also am very deeply tied to looking at issues of immigrants and immigration reform. I think we need it all, and I certainly hope that I can see some really significant change within my lifetime. And I also feel strongly it won't happen without communities like you raising voices in innovative ways and supporting this wonderful organization, Building One Community. So of course wars, like we see in Ukraine and Syria or Afghanistan, have led to significant formal refugee resettlement through the Office of the High Commissioner of Refugees and the International Organization of Migration. But we need to be clear that fewer than 1%, less than 1% of officially designated refugees will ever be resettled to a third country, one of those countries being the United States. And while historically the United States has been a great welcomer, at least we portray ourselves as such, of refugees, numerically we have taken in the largest numbers of refugees through the resettlement program since 1980 of any country in a similar program in the world. But per capita, we haven't done nearly as well. We have much more capacity to resettle through that formal program. I've worked on this for 15 years now, and I believe I had blinders on. I was too focused on the resettlement program and didn't look at how drivers were affecting a much broader swath of people that we could think of as forced migrants. And so while wars like Ukraine may be in the news, and very importantly so, we need to follow that issue. Soon issues of refugees around Ukraine are going to fall out of the news, and there'll be many fewer supports for them. We need to pay attention, as Jennifer said, to other drivers of forced migration and even rethink what we categorize as a refugee. Certainly this is happening within advocacy communities and amongst the practitioners who are working day-to-day, hand-in-hand, either in camps or in urban locales or in communities like yours. So, of course, factors like high levels of internal conflict, such as we see within countries that have very powerful local militias or cartel activity in Central America, those are drivers. And it's something like civil war, but not quite defined in that way. And we really do need to take seriously that that is a driver. Others will flee on the basis of individual persecution. So for example, we host a very renowned journalist at our institution who had to leave her country and flee across borders because her life was targeted because of the work she did in journalism. There wasn't an internal civil war in her country, but she was targeted and persecuted and almost lost her life because of her work within the field of journalism. So you might be targeted on the basis of your political views, your ethnicity or your nationality, your religious identity in particular, or membership in a social group, such as Jennifer said. You might be gay, lesbian, transgendered in your home country, and that itself becomes the site of persecution. But beyond this, and I think this is the part we really need to think seriously about in terms of that broader one community, one humanity, is the question of the question of weak state structure. So we sometimes call it failed states, and economies that might be in very serious decline or collapse for a range of factors, not any one factor, not just climate change, but perhaps a history of political repression and failed institutions. Certainly, my ancestors came to the United States in the 1910s and 1920s during a time when they were not kept out. They came from Northern Europe, but they came out of incredible poverty, where child malnutrition, early infant death happened in northern Norway, in northern Sweden. There were no barriers for them to get here except for the cost of the journey across the ocean. They certainly weren't turned away once they passed the health check at Ellis Island. So my family could be considered economic refugees or economic migrants today, and I think we need to take seriously economic conditions as major factors leading to forced migration, not just the choice to move. Finally, climate change under the current administration has actually been recognized as a major driver. So President Biden, when he came to office, reversed a series of executive orders that had been put in place by President Trump, and in one of the early executive orders said we need to look seriously at the impact of climate on migration. And I think this is something that's only going to pick up steam, certainly at the United Nations and in the Office of High Commissioner of Refugees. They're starting to look seriously at needing to add a category around environmental collapse, climate change as a basis for support at the international level. No one of these factors necessarily is what drives an individual or a family to leave. Sometimes it's a complex interrelation of them, and so we need to keep that in mind. I'm only going to say just a few words about, because I'm already past my time, about the current state of displaced populations in the Northeast. And I think the main point is one that I hadn't thought seriously enough about until the last couple of years. And that is that officially recognized refugees in our community, they're relatively small. So whether it's in New York or in Connecticut or in Massachusetts, they're a small fraction of the overall population of displaced persons. So we might see through the official resettlement program that there were 1,600 refugees who arrived in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York in the last couple of years. There are 1.2 million undocumented individuals in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York. And many of them are asylum seekers who are either, they have formal cases that are to be adjudicated at somewhere very distant down the future unless they have excellent help from organizations like this. Or they won't even get any legal aid and they're going to have a failed case and then they need to make, again, yet another set of decisions. So I think my overarching point here is that we really need to get away from these silos of refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants. I know we set up those formal definitions, but really we need to recognize that we need very broad-based immigration reform to recognize the humanity of all who have come to be within our lovely state and our region.
Thank you, Kathy. Moose, the second question is for you. Now, Kathy has just discussed some of the drivers or push factors of forced migration. Can you share with us some key pull factors as they may affect the entire range of immigration to the United States, from the most disadvantaged to the higher skilled, and why do we need immigrants in the U.S. and in places like Fairfield County?
Thank you so much, and I'm so delighted to be here. I must admit that I got introduced to Building One Community from Dan Wilson, who was one of your volunteers when he was just finishing his career in the multinational corporate world, and he was looking to see where he would spend his time as a volunteer. And we had a discussion in a cafe in Greenwich Village, and I was telling him all kinds of great, lofty places where he could do it, and he calls me later, he said, no, I will decide to do it at Building One Community. So it's a huge tribute to you that people, volunteers like Dan, keep this organization that it is, because it is communities like this which form our country. and which also define who we are, which we frequently forget, thinking that all policy gets made in Washington, D.C. Let me just quickly talk about pull factors and try to do it as concisely as I can. We think of ourselves as the ultimate nation of immigrants, the penultimate nation of immigrants. Let me tell you, we have always, for a nation of immigrants, we have always been ambivalent about immigration. People will tell you that George Washington himself said that we don't need any more immigrants except a few skilled carpenters. Then we know what we did with the Germans and the Irish and the Italians and the Slavs and the Jews. But we have never been more a nation of immigrants than we are today. There are like 45 million foreign-born people in the country. That's about 14.5% of the country's population. That's the highest in numerical numbers. It's not the highest in per capita, which still belongs to the beginning of the 20th century. But of these, if you look at the labor market, 17% of our workers today are foreign-born. And then if you look at the low-skilled occupations, which is what my demographer friends define as occupations which require less than a high school degree, that 54% of low-skilled occupations are immigrants. So the issue is why, how did this happen? And we can spend all evening about it. For teasing, let me tell you only 4 or 5 factors which are responsible for it. First, we restructured our economy in the last 40 years. We have moved away from a manufacturing economy to a service economy. That has consequences in the labor market. Second, actually the wages have not kept up with inflation in the last 50 years. If you take inflation into account, people in low-skilled occupations make less today than they made in 1973. The third, and frequently forgotten, we have become an aging society. We are fast getting the trappings of European societies and Japan. I don't think I'll shock any one of you. There are 76 million baby boomers in our country. All 76 million will turn 65 in the next 7 years, by 2029. About 3 million baby boomers retire a year. I just learned only last week that during the pandemic, more baby boomers left the labor market than in the prior years. By 2035, again, my demographer friends, who I like to only quote since I'm not one, there'll be more people over the age of 65 in our country than under the age of 18. That is considered a demographic milestone. So this has impact in the labor market. There are fewer people. There are, I think, 41 baby boomers in the labor market today. They're fast retiring, opening the jobs for people who they fill. The last thing is that we have actually become a more educated society. Again, the beginning of the 20th century, only 10% Americans graduated high school. Today, about 85% Americans graduate high school. That's very good news for the country, but it has implications in the labor market. Because if you're a high school graduate, your aspiration is not to take a dead-end, low-wage job. And all these factors are contributing to why we have become more and more dependent on immigrant labor. The Bureau of Labor Statistics tells you that the occupations in which we'll need immigrants the most in the next decade or so, are the service sector of the economy, which includes everything from food service to hospitality to janitorial services, healthcare, elder care, infant care. We will need people in hospitality industry, as I said, I think earlier. We need people in agriculture. The farm is heavily dependent. We'll need immigrants in the construction. And in the high end of the occupation, we need people in the STEM-based industries. That for whatever reason, US graduates just don't want to go to STEM fields. It's hard work to study science and math. And no wonder we then have to take immigrants from all those countries to get. So these are the occupations in which immigrants are dominant, and they will continue to remain dominant if that is the trend. So the question is, if we need people so badly, how do we have 11 million unauthorized people in the country? That is the dilemma of our immigration system. So I'm just teeing up my answer for the next question, but those are the pull factors.
Thank you. Mike, it's your turn. Mike, I understand, or we understand you came to the U.S. when you were just 10 years old, and he came here to join your mother, who was living in Stamford. Can you tell us a bit why your mother chose to leave Honduras and bring the family to Stamford?
Yeah, good evening. Thanks for having me, and all the folks who reached out and who planned this event. It was fun. It was great outside. And I really liked the teaser because I think it really leads into my own experience as an immigrant and sort of the choices that folks have to make these days in Central America, which is feeding a lot of the immigration that's coming in through our southern border. And so my mother decided to come to the United States when I was 4, when we were living in Honduras. And that's pretty much the only choice she made from that point on. Because once she decided she wanted to come to the United States for a better life, she couldn't choose how she would get here because the immigration system didn't give her any choices on how to come here. You can't just go to the embassy and say, I want to go to the United States to have a better life. That used to be the case, as we sort of did a crash course on immigration history. And I was at Ellis Island for the first time about 4 weeks ago. And that was my question, just going through the exhibits and thinking back and reflecting on in 2008, when my mother then, the second part of the question, when she decides to bring me here. So it was only my mother who was here. And she decided, and I learned later, her plan was always to bring me. At first, and the way she got away with it was when she came to the US, she said, Mike, I'm going back to the city, because she used to work in the city. We're from a small town in Honduras. And I didn't really believe her, but we kind of all went along with the story. Yeah, mom's going to the city. She'll be back for the weekend. And as I was at Ellis Island, I was thinking back. There was no Ellis Island for me either. So when my mother chose to bring me here, I didn't have a say in the matter. And it was during a school day, actually. I just got pulled out of school, and I was told, you're leaving tomorrow to the United States. And I was really scared because one of my great-grandmothers, she was really against the idea of children making the trek up to the United States. And she told me that, listen, if you get caught at the border, and I didn't know what that meant. Like, I had heard like what a visa was. I knew it was like some kind of travel document. I wasn't really sure what it meant. She said, if you get caught at the border, you're gonna be forced to like serve in the military as like a kid. So I made sure that I made it to the United States without being enlisted at 10 years old in the US military. And I did have to check a box when I applied for FAFSA though, but, so there's a lack of like market choice for folks that are coming out of Central America. And really the only choice we have is the toughest choice of all, which is to decide to come here in the first place and to do it in a way that's dangerous, that's uncertain. And that uncertainty, and I'll speak about that later, only starts when you make the journey. You're always living in a state of uncertainty. And I would say that even though it was the hardest choice, we were talking about this last year with my mother, it's the best choice we have made.
Thank you, Mike. Before we begin round 2, dive deeper into immigration, integration, please don't forget to jot down your questions for the panelists and raise your hand if you would like one of our staff to pick it up. Okay, so Kathy, back to you. Can you share stories of how immigrants and refugees are integrating successfully in our region?
Yes, and excuse me as I turn on my stopwatch so I don't go over my time this time. Can you hear me? I hope there's not too much feedback. Great, that's great. So I'm going to speak more to refugees and asylum seekers at this point, thinking about how they have been supported especially by community organizations and then local informal community groups like I'm sure many of you are part of. They're supported and successfully integrating throughout the state, both in rural and urban parts, with different strengths and opportunities depending on the locale, as well as different challenges. So certainly, both asylum seeker and refugee families are caring for their children, securing work, and setting up their households, often with the support of community groups. And for asylum seekers, that community-based support or informal family support is critical because mostly they would not qualify for public benefits that refugees would ordinarily qualify for. So for example, a Syrian couple in West Hartford and Hartford has been able to set up a small business. The male within the household has taken the lead, but the wife, the husband took the lead. The wife actually has an extraordinarily successful business on her own, and that was not expected. She's learned English relatively quickly, and this is really with the support of about 40 volunteers who are working hand in hand through what's called the Community Co-Sponsorship Model in collaboration with Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services out of New Haven. Now, there are at least 4 or 5 of those groups here in this area that are also working alongside IRIS, and so some of you may have actually served as volunteers in some of your local groups, whether here in Stamford, up in Ridgefield, in Danbury, or further down along the shore. A young Afghan couple with 2 children has been able to secure work in their field of training, and actually at the high skilled level. The husband had an extraordinary background and ability to speak English, as well as was trained in filmmaking and the arts, and was able, through community connections, to secure a fellowship which we hope will lead to long-term work in his field around cultural preservation and working on advocating for knowledge about Afghanistan within the United States. And then just as a final example, several young Afghan men, cousins, who initially were dispersed throughout the United States, have made their way together to live in the Stamford area and are supported by one of the local resettlement groups here. And while they have entered the labor force on more of what we would consider that entry-level service-based work, they all have aspirations to attend community college and college. And indeed, we're trying to work within university systems in the state to make that more possible for more refugees and asylum seekers who've come on a pathway that's non-traditional and may be entering higher education later in their life. So these successes really have been predicated on engaged local communities, extraordinary welcome. And for refugees resettling, generally community groups commit to a year. But for asylum seekers, you need to be in it for a very long haul, as we'll hear about, because often work authorization and formal supports don't come through for many years. And so it is quite a responsibility to decide as a community that you're going to work with supporting an asylum seeker family.
Thanks, Kathy. And what about some of the barriers?
Oh, I should speak a little about the barriers. So the barriers are real. These include for asylum seekers, and you may not know, but for Afghans and eventually as Ukrainians begin to arrive in higher numbers, they're coming with a status known as humanitarian parole, which is a temporary status. In the official policy, a 2-year temporary status, although it'll probably be prolonged. It kind of depends on who the next administration is, though. So while we think that we may have opened the doors to some 80,000 Afghans, more than half of those have humanitarian parole status, and they're in this limbo place. They're in a place of uncertainty, as Michael was talking about. And certainly it's organizations like your own that have actually put the resources into legal assistance, very knowledgeable legal assistance that's going to help folks like Afghans, Ukrainians, and others who are in your communities to seek a more certain future. Other barriers, actually one of the most profound, you know well in your community as well. We know it well in Hartford and West Hartford, certainly in New Haven, and that is access to affordable housing. Without access to affordable housing that's decent, and I stress that because we've certainly seen numerous cases where the only affordable housing actually wasn't habitable, wasn't proximate to grocery stores or good bus lines. These are fundamental questions of human rights, actually, and they directly impact families and individuals. So one of the most substantial barriers, even for community groups who are quite good at organizing, is securing the housing. Without affordable housing, you're going to experience food insecurity. And this is a problem within Connecticut, but it's also a challenge nationwide. And so we just have to face up to it. This is one of the biggest barriers.
Thank you, Kathy. Moose, you were sharing some key pull factors and how immigrants benefit this country. You have argued that the United States immigration system is not serving our national interests, and there has not been any significant reform of the United States immigration system since the 1990s. With that in mind, how might an immigration system be built that would rationally work with these pull factors and serve our national interests while supporting immigrant integration?
Again, this is what we could spend all night on, but let me just summarize this. Kathy laid it very well that we have issues about protection. People are trying to come to this country looking, fleeing persecution or other forms of torture and all that. And they're coming to our southern border. We have a crisis at the southern border. There's no other way of describing it. And we have 11 million people in our country who are unauthorized. So I like to say that if we just open our front door more, there will be less pressure on the back door. I mean, it's as simple as anything in physics. And it's our front door that is dysfunctional. The front door is what we call the legal immigration selection system. It's sort of not who we keep out, but whom do we admit? Whom do we seek to admit? And that's based on an architecture that was built in 1952. Our immigration law today was written in 1952. It has been tinkered with only a few times since, in 1965, in 1986, last time in 1990. And under that system, so that before, since I'm an immigrant, I just be optimistic about our country. Before we say we have become a xenophobic country, we admit 1 million people a year with green cards. We are still the world's most generous country in admitting immigrants. Let's just not forget that. But how we select these 1 million people is described by our selection system. Most of these people, 66% precisely, are picked on the basis of their family connection. And the rest, about 140,000, are picked on the basis of needed skills in the country. Then we pick people on the basis of their refugee status, and since 1990, we have a very small stream of immigrants we pick on the basis of diversity. I'll talk about that if you want me to do. But if you look at 140,000 people, that means only 15% of our selection system is based on labor needs of our country. These 140,000 also include the family members of the person whom we are sponsoring. So essentially, only 7% of our immigration is based on the demonstrated labor market need of our country. Now, that just does not make any sense. You could be a Trump supporter and the most liberal person on this doesn't make sense. So what we have argued is that we have to open our immigration system for broad skills, from high skills to low skills. Today, the only way you can get a green card, about 80% of people who get green cards are actually moving from H-1B workers to green card holders. If you don't H-1B high-skilled workers, about 70% of them are computer occupation people. So I don't want to scare anyone. If we want the future of our country are going to be the children and the grandchildren of computer engineers. Nothing wrong with computer engineers, but do we want our entire country to be full of descendants of computer engineers? So that's the nature of our selection system. So we have said this is outdated, that what we need to pick is what we are calling at the Migration Policy Institute a bridge visa, is that we should let in, and large number of people, I'll come to that in a second, people from all occupations, from being a physicist to being a person who wants to do elder care in our country. And they should be sponsored by a US employer. We should establish that no US worker is losing the job by your sponsorship. And then we allow them to come for 3 years on the basis of a labor certification. At the end of 3 years, they get a choice that they could go back to their countries of origin. So, look, I did my 3 years, that's all I wanted. Or they can come stay for another 3 years. At the end of 6 years, they should make up their mind. Do they want to stay in the country as permanent residents or go back and come back later for skill? What we also learned that not all workers want to live in the United States for the rest of their lives. And we used to think that being a cosmopolitan person was reserved only for the high-end people. Middle class people can aspire to live in more than one place in their life. Our present immigration system doesn't allow that. You have to kind of burn your bridges to the old country. And we think that kind of a circular migration is more an answer to our system than the present is one size fits all. And what that number should be should not be decided by lawmakers who do it on the basis of political calculation. That every year that number should be set by an independent body of experts, labor economists, financial people, all, at the local and the state level, so how many people do we need? That should become the number. Listen, we set interest rates in our country every quarter. Sometimes we don't set immigration limits for the last 35 years. I mean, that doesn't make sense to anyone. So that's what we need to change. Independent bodies should fix that number. They should be coming in a circular way. So we'll have both the flexibility in the system and circularity in the system.
We're going to move on to round 3. We're running out of time. Now we're going to talk about the power of the communities.
Sorry, do we have one more?
Oh, yeah, I'm going to wrap him into the next one. Yeah, he's going to get the final say. So, Kathy, in one of your articles, The Role of Communities in Refugee Resettlement, you discuss community sponsorship, community teams, as a successful model for refugee resettlement to help with refugee resettlement agencies that are very, very stretched thin. Can you talk about what these community teams do and why it is a successful model?
Yeah, actually, I've spoken a little bit about this, so I'm going to keep it short so that we're sure that there's plenty of time for questions. But basically, community groups take on the role of what were called resettlement organizations. So you're familiar perhaps with integrated refugee and immigrant services, who would hire a social worker and a whole team of specialists who might work with schools and with the Department of Social Services, Medicaid, and set up for wraparound services. More? Okay. Now, by demand of community members, actually, communities came together around 2015 with the incredible kind of crisis of the Syrian war and said, we can do more and we can actually support more individuals if you allow us to have a space at the table to do that very work. So when a refugee would arrive, the community group would actually sign up children for school, help people get their social security number, secure that first employment, make sure they had housing when they arrived. So actually, volunteers took on the responsibility of resettlement agencies. This trend of community sponsorship is called privatization in a global setting. Canada actually is a very big pioneer on it. And oftentimes people think of privatization, especially if you're maybe a university professor on the left, that's not a good thing. We would argue that actually it allows for the capacity to support more refugees if we involve communities more deeply. And research that a team of researchers at the University of Connecticut have been involved in shows that it actually has a very positive effect, not only on supporting refugees to access those first jobs, to be able to keep their housing, but it has a positive effect on the community members as well. So a greater sense of civic purpose and ties amongst people who might not ordinarily have come together. This model has been played out now in Connecticut. Connecticut is the model in the country. In fact, they're leading a large national initiative that's partly a federal initiative as well as a private philanthropic initiative called the Community Sponsor Hubs. And this was piloted with Afghans. It's now taking place with Ukrainians. The Biden administration is set to lay out this policy as a formal policy, we hope, allowing for private sponsorship as another pathway for refugees. Importantly, I think this model could really be applied for asylum seekers and for those who've been successful in their claims for asylum or asylees. And we're seeing that also playing out in Connecticut. So Connecticut's again at the forefront of innovating around community supports for asylum seekers. Some of your organizations may be doing that right now.
Thank you, Kathy. It'd be great if you could share a little bit about your own integration journey into the community and what role the community played in shaping your journey.
Yeah, and I think I got very lucky to grow up here in Stamford because Stamford is one of those really special communities. And as you go around the country and you start reading all these books that are, coming out of Brookings Institute, AEI, and all these other Washington think tanks, and you hear about other communities in the country that are struggling, and Stamford is the opposite of that. And so that is part of it. I came into a community that had all these assets. It has the school system. It had the ELL program. It had stakeholders like you who care about what happens in the community. It had after-school activities. And my integration journey, it's so interconnected to school because that's where I've spent almost all of my time since I arrived in the US. And that's given me a lot of privilege within the immigrant community because it's not only a safe space to be in, no one's gonna ask you what your immigration status is. It was also a great waiting room because that entire time I was going through an immigration process trying to get my green card, which I did. I got it last year. And so schools have like shaped that integration journey. They've made it easier. They've been welcoming, and I continue to see that. And I just continue to be amazed. I was just at TOR back in June talking to some of the ELL students there, and it's just so amazing how well we are able to integrate people and how much people are willing to integrate themselves into this community because they really want to be a part of it. And that was one part of it for me. And I would also say that a lot of the non-government and non-school institutions were really important in shaping that as well. Building One Community was one of them, but there were plenty of other after-school clubs that I'm sure you're familiar with, like Yearwood Center, right, JCC, great places. So that was part of the journey.
What is the role of communities in shaping immigration policy?
Well, immigration policies we might think get made in Washington, D.C. But people who make policies in Washington, D.C. come from communities. I mean, they represent communities. And they should reflect that. And they increasingly don't. And I think just because a lot of communities have decided that it's not their place to make national policy, that as long as they are active themselves with the local policy, that's enough. And my sort of to correct everyone is that we really have to be active in the national policy, which we have to really change the discourse on immigration in our country, that we have to assert that immigration is a value. It is what makes America distinct in the community of nations. And we need it not just because of our history, it's our future. I mean, I didn't want to scare you when I was talking about pull factors. The most important demographic factor about why we need immigrants is our social security system. All of you know our social security system is likely to go bankrupt by 2035. For it to remain viable, you need active, young, working people. And given the aging argument I was making, that increasingly has to come from immigrants. So if we don't need immigrants for anything for the labor market need, we certainly need them to keep our social security system alive. And that argument can be made by people in the community who are looking at their retirement and they're looking at their healthcare needs of their parents and their grandparents, who are looking at infant care needs. These are concrete issues. When you go to our hospital system, I mean, you look around, every third doctor is foreign-born. If you look at the emergency rooms of our country, it's full of people who speak strange tongues. Uh, it's just if you don't speak a tongue, you're not a good active hospital. So so multiplying these examples is what people need to hear. Immigration is not a kind of a demographic fact, which obviously it is, but it's also a story of who we are and who we need to be. And that's, I think, what the role of community is in speaking to the lawmakers is.
Well, thank you, panelists. Thank you, panelists, for a very interesting and invigorating discussion. I'd like to now open it up to discussion for questions from the audience members. Paola Idrovo and Lauren Hughes, our superstar attorneys and IJC fellows, will be taking it from here, wherever they may be.
Here to read out your very amazing questions. So the first one I think is general to the panel, if we're ready. Okay. Yes, there we go, okay. What is the need for healthcare reform due to the current state of immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees? I think anybody can take that, but no, Jen, who?
Oh, to anyone.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just take one small piece of this, okay? So for refugees who come officially on the refugee resettlement program, they do have access to health care, initially through Medicaid and then perhaps through their employer. But for asylum seekers, it is a very uncertain path. So unless you have very urgent emergencies and the emergency room won't turn you away, or unless you're pregnant, access to preventive health care is often too expensive. So we definitely need to address the full humanity, I think, of those who are in our communities. It's a matter of life often, especially around, I see in the volunteer groups, questions about access to life-saving treatment for cancer. And so that often is invisible to us in the broader community, but for asylum seekers or other undocumented individuals, getting treatment for chronic disease is often an enormous barrier. Now, we might think of that as a human rights concern, as I would frame, but also it's an extraordinary strain on our health system when people have to rely on emergency services when they're maybe toward the end of their life. And it's an extraordinary strain on their families, which will have ripple effects for many years.
Thank you. We have a question that's directed to Muz. The federal government controls immigration policy under the Constitution. However, if political gridlock continues to block meaningful national immigration reform, how much latitude do state and local governments have to make adjustments, and what would be the most important ones we should try to put into practice?
Well, that's a good question. I think as the question implies, we have had paralysis on immigration reform, at least for the last 20 years, despite all the facts which suggests that we should reform our immigration policy. Because there's a lot of agreement on facts. Really, there's both from the right and the left. There's a lot of agreement. There's also a lot of agreement on what policies we need to correct it. The problem is politics, is that it is no political will to make it happen. And that's, what got us Trump. You could say why it's taken so long for Biden to unwind. We know all that. So therefore, in the absence of federal government working on immigration, it has now come to states and localities to pick the pieces. Now, states and localities have limited ability to influence immigration policy. They can't decide how many people we can let in. They can't decide that we need more nurses, therefore we should increase green card. That's the exclusive role of the federal government. What they're left with are sort of the integration policies. So this is the thing we should all understand about we have an immigration policy and we have an immigrant policy. Immigration policy is whom do we admit? Immigrant policies, how do we treat people once they are here? We have a highly liberal, generous immigration policy. We have almost no immigrant policies. We have kind of decided that people should be left on there. That's why the volunteer system is coming in. And that, look, families have done it, unions have done it, community organizations. Federal government should have no role to do it. But when you see immigrants coming to cities, local governments are now entering, they're forced to enter into this realm. So we have people getting involved about licensing, credentialing. I mean, it's a very important part of, a lot of immigrants come who are qualified in their own countries, but are not licensed to work here. So we have argued that, look, credentialing of a lot of the occupations should change so that we don't waste the brains of people in doing, the sort of the classic thing is doctors driving cabs. I mean, that should not happen. That's a brain drain in our own cities. So credentialing is a really important part. Same thing about English. I mean, English learning is the most fundamental integration tool. English learning, to me, three important tools are, which is what integration people always, it's learning English, getting a job, increasing your income, buying houses, and intermarriage. These are really the four indices. We actually, as a country, despite lack of immigrant policies, doing really well. I mean, all studies show that by second generation, immigrants of today are doing as well, if not better, than prior waves of immigrants. I mean, there's a National Academy of Sciences study of that in 2017. There's an extremely good new book written by two professors from Harvard, from Stamford and Princeton, called The Streets of Gold, the America's Untold Story of Immigrant Success. And this looks at all these factors of how the income is going up, and this is all happening at the local level. And so I think encouraging English learning, encouraging employment, encouraging naturalization, encouraging sort of the intermarriage, all these are indices of success. And the last thing I want to say about what's happening at the local level is that given the lack of attention to the federal level, local governments are now used to doing law enforcement because that's where the rubber meets the road. Someone who makes the wrong left turn in a street in Stamford could be put in immigration proceedings. That's how our immigration and criminal justice system are connected now. And in that regard, that's a huge part of local government. And local governments really have to decide, do they want to put someone who has a very good record on everything else other than just made a long wrong into removal proceedings or no? So people have to devise immigration enforcement sort of policies which directly affect the lives of immigrants.
Thank you. And Michael, we have a question for you, which is, if you could change one thing throughout your immigration experience, what do you think would have made the most impact? That's a tough one.
That is a tough one, but good question nonetheless. I think what would have had a bigger impact, it would have been to have the choice to come here legally. And so just sort of like being in that process earlier, because I actually didn't start my immigration process till 2015, because we found out there was a law that I could use that it's actually gotten a lot of it's become a little mainstream recently, especially given kind of the changing circumstances of immigration. And it's a law that protects minors who came unaccompanied to the United States called SIJ. So I wish we had known about that law earlier, because I did qualify before. But thankfully, like, the timeline and everything worked out. And if you know youth who might have come here unaccompanied or meet some of those criteria, please spread the word, because it's a great way to change your legal status. And a lot of people just are not aware of it. We literally just found out because we did some research online and talked to an attorney. So just the earlier piece, I guess. Yeah.
Speak to your local immigration attorney sounds to be the advice. Jen, do we have time for a couple more questions, or how are we doing? Okay, great. So our next question is, how can technology and or technologists aid in immigration reform? That one's open to the panel.
Any of us, I've become a really big fan of technology more than I used to, and it comes actually from lawyers. And I'm a lawyer, and I cut my teeth representing people in removal proceedings. And one of the things that happens when you take on an immigration case, and I speak to all volunteers, is that if you sign an immigration form, it's called G28, which is lawyer representation form, that I will represent this person, you're stuck with this for the rest of your life. That's why a lot of people do not take immigration cases. Because once you sign their case, you're responsible as a lawyer, as an officer of the court. Everything that happens in the case, you get a letter. I still get correspondence of a job that I had 20 years ago. And so I think what lawyers have devised is use portals. Really, you start with a case. It's like what's happened to medicine, that you have a case file, which is like digital. And you take a lawyer to a certain point, and then when you are done with that point, you hand over that portal to some other lawyer, so that you really don't have the whole paper file in your big file cabinets to moving from California to New York. You could really have your first lawyer represent you in Texas, a detention facility. That's all they have ability to do. Then your case gets to California, you find another volunteer lawyer to do it there. And the portal, this technology portal, moves with you. This has really happened a lot in immigration proceedings. The second point that you made about work authorization was people are not getting work authorization for years. The damn, what I call clogged arteries of our immigration system are, simple thing. You're actually entitled to work, but the government has to give you a card. I mean, what is there to adjudicate about that application? Why don't you apply online in a new technology format, where they check all your criteria, and then you get digitally your work authorization, which any employer could use. So these are sort of some of the technological developments which are missing. And last thing I would say is, a lot of people agreed on, you could have hearings in courts on video cameras. That you could have a very smart lawyer sitting in New York in her pajamas, representing someone in a detention facility when a young fumbling lawyer is mending his ties, he doesn't know what he's doing. I think those technology developments really have improved the ability of serving people in a long distance.
I would add, and I think this speaks to Michael's point around education, there's important work happening for being able to upload your transcripts and your certifications and your records around education globally for refugees. Because often when you arrive, if you flee and you arrive outside your country, you may not actually have the records that show you got your master's degree in journalism, for example. So there's a really wonderful project out of the University of California, Davis, known as Article 26 Backpack. That refers to an article in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Students work together to help refugee youth who are in camps or maybe in urban locales to actually secure their documents, upload them into the cloud in an encrypted way, and then when they actually make it to a place where they may be able to access higher education, they can access those documents.
Our next question requires a slight bit of historical knowledge, so bear with me if you aren't familiar with the program. But the question is, what are the barriers to restarting programs like the Bracero program? And for those of you who aren't familiar, that was a temporary worker program set up between Mexico and the United States in the first half of the 20th century. So what are the barriers to setting up something like a temporary worker exchange or something along those lines?
Trying to dodge that question by talking about the bridge visa. So that you there's a lot of historical controversy about temporary workers. The Bracero program, a lot of people thought was like Harvest of Shame, where we're exploiting agricultural workers, mostly from Mexico. Program ended in 1964. I think we don't really need to have large temporary worker programs. The policy that we have advocated from our institute is that we should have in our selection system some people who come without testing any labor market. They should be able to come here within a week. I mean, take the Einsteins of the world. There's no reason to give a labor market test to Einstein. I mean, everyone should be glad that people like Einstein are coming. So that's one end. On the other hand, people should be able to come on these seasonal workers only for really seasonal work. If it is harvesting one crop, or working at a resort in the summer, or working in a resort, which are known to be clearly seasonal work. For everything else, we should allow people to come through the bridge visa, which means everyone really from high end of the occupation, low end, and then they should be allowed to come here for 3 years at a time, extendable by 6 years, ability to come in the future, or to become permanent residents if they choose. I think that's the way to do it, not expand temporary worker programs, because they are ridden with exploitation. So they should be minimized as much as possible.
All right. Does anyone have one more question that they would like to throw out? If not, I have a personal question that I could give out. Yes. Okay. Well, I very much found you all to be a riveting panel. So I think my last question will be, I know we kind of already asked this to Michael, but what would be your at the top of your wish list on the new, I guess, on an immigration reform policy? What do you think would be the number one most important thing?
How the wish list would be, I really like the policy I'm hearing to my right. More choices for sort of the circular flow, because it's true, I can tell you anecdotally, a lot of people come to this country and they're like, I'm gonna go back to Guatemala in 4 years. And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But I think those choices should be there. And isn't it really great? Like, I was in Europe 2 months ago, and it was so nice just to hear people like out in the subway saying, well, yeah, like I just got here on like a train from Germany, or like, you know, like I'm studying at Sciences Po in Paris for like the next 2 semesters. And I'm like, good, like you should have that option. And so I think I'm gonna go with the policy I'm hearing here.
At least convince one person.
Well, thank you, everyone. It was really lovely this evening, and I guess if there are no other further questions, I'm just heading on back up.
I told you we were going to have a terrific panel, so thank you so much again. I'm coming to close the session, but I wanted to share the winners of tonight. So here we go. And I'll be very brief because I know everybody wants to get home soon. Crane Song photo session goes to Sara Cepeda. Yay! Mount Snow foursome of golf, Mara Fitzpatrick. Yay! Private flower arrangement, Sonia Alcantarilla. The oil portrait painting with Clayton Alexander goes to David Chartman. The beautiful handcrafted tables by John Lane, thank you, John, again, goes to Marianne Khan. You got them. The 4-round flight tickets through Avilo goes to Lawrence Cavanaugh. Oh, I see a happy face. One night stay at Marriott is Heather Elliott. The 2 ticket subscription to Stamford Symphony goes to Madeleine Tucci. Thank you. And the amazing wine basket donated by our B1C board goes to Lauren Slatkin. So, Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight again, for showing up for our immigrant community, and for all your support. Have a great evening.